First, story The Curse of Evergreen Falls. It was a snowy Christmas Eve when I arrived in Evergreen Falls, a secluded village in Vermont. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, and every window glowed with the warmth of the season. Yet, there was a chill that went beyond the cold air, an unease that gnawed at me the moment I stepped into the village. I had been invited by my aunt, Margaret, to spend Christmas with her and my 7-year-old cousin, Ethan. She had moved here a year ago to escape city life and start fresh. The house was beautiful, but isolated on the edge of a dense forest. Margaret warned me of one thing: never mention Santa Claus in front of Ethan. It sounded odd, but I didn't question her. That night, as Ethan and I sat by the fireplace, he asked me in a whispered tone, "Do you believe in him?" "Santa?" I asked. Ethan nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "He isn't like these stories. Here, he comes to punish naughty kids." Last year, Mrs. Henderson's son disappeared on Christmas Eve. They say he found Santa's list. Margaret scolded Ethan for speaking nonsense and sent him to bed. But her face betrayed her fear. I couldn't shake Ethan's words from my mind. Around midnight, a strange noise woke me. It was a low, rasping chuckle coming from outside. Curious, I peered out the window. Standing beneath the frosted pine trees was a figure dressed in a tattered red suit. His beard wasn't white, but streaked with dark stains, and his eyes glowed like embers. I froze as the figure lifted a long scroll and began reading names. I heard Ethan's voice cry out from his room. I rushed to him, only to find his bed empty and the window wide open. Panic set in as I ran into the snowy woods, calling for Ethan. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches creaking with the weight of the wind. Then I saw them, footprints leading to a clearing lit by an eerie red glow. There he was, standing before the figure in the red suit. "You're on the list," the figure growled, his voice like shattering glass. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a fallen branch and charged at the figure. He let out a horrible laugh and vanished into a cloud of ash, leaving Ethan collapsed in the snow. We never spoke of that night again, but Margaret moved away soon after. I still wake up to the sound of that rasping chuckle sometimes, and I know the curse of Evergreen Falls is far from over. Second story, The Whispers of Christmas Hollow. It was Christmas Eve when my mother and I arrived in Christmas Hollow, a small village hidden deep in the snow-covered mountains of Vermont. The town was charming at first glance, quaint houses decorated with twinkling lights, and a giant Christmas tree standing proudly in the center of the square. But there was a strange stillness to the place that made me uneasy. We had come to visit Aunt Lydia, who lived in an old Victorian house on the edge of the village. Her home was cold and dark when we arrived, despite the cheery wreath on the door. Lydia greeted us with a nervous smile, and I noticed how tired and frail she looked. "The storm will be bad tonight. Best to stay inside and keep the fire burning," she said as we settled in. As the wind howled outside. I lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the ancient house. I was about to fall asleep when I heard it, a soft whispering voice coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the words were clear. "Help me. Please help me." I tiptoed out of my room and into the dim hallway. Following the sound, it led me to a door I hadn't noticed before. A small wooden one with a rusty handle. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I descended slowly, the whispers growing louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs was a cold, stone room lit by a flickering lantern. In the center stood a little boy in ragged clothes, his eyes wide with fear. "You have to hide me. You have to hide me," he pleaded, grabbing my hand. Before I could respond, a loud bang came from upstairs and the lantern went out. The boy screamed, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned to see a shadowy figure looming behind me, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. "Leave now," it growled, "or be trapped forever." I grabbed the boy and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. When I looked back, the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. My mother and Aunt Lydia found me sitting on the floor, trembling. I tried to explain what happened, but they said there was no basement in the house. The next morning, we left Christmas Hollow. As we drove away, I glanced back and saw the little boy standing in the snow, waving goodbye with a sad smile. To this day, I can still hear his whisper in my dreams, begging for help that I couldn't give. Third story, The Whispering Wreath. It was a quiet Christmas Eve in the small town of Marion, North Carolina. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the streets in a white stillness. I was house-sitting for the Bennett family, an old Victorian house at the end of Maple Lane. Their 9-year-old daughter, Emily, had left behind a wreath she had made in school, hanging proudly on the front door. That wreath was the first thing I noticed when I arrived. It was simple, made of evergreens and red ribbons, but what caught my eye was the small bell dangling at the center. It jingled softly, even though there was no wind. As the evening grew darker, the house felt colder, despite the fireplace roaring in the living room. I wrapped myself in a blanket and settled on the couch, reading a book. Suddenly, the bell on the wreath jingled again. I froze. The front door was locked, and the snow outside showed no signs of footprints. I approached the door slowly, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. But as I turned away, a whisper echoed through the house. "Emily." It was a soft voice, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. Searched the house, checking every room. Everything was just as I had left it. But then, the whispering began again. "Emily needs you." This time, it was closer, coming from the direction of the wreath. Terrified, I grabbed my phone to call the Bennetts. Emily's mother answered, her voice shaking. "The wreath? Get rid of it," she shouted. Emily made it for her friend Anna, who died last year. We keep hearing her name every time we hang it. As I reached for the wreath, the bell jingled furiously, and the whispers grew into a low chant. The air around me turned freezing. I ripped the wreath from the door and threw it into the fireplace. The flames flared bright green, and for a moment I saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. It looked like a young girl with hollow eyes, staring at me with a mix of sorrow and anger. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house fell silent. The fire burned normally, and the air felt warm again. I spent the rest of the night sleepless, waiting for the Bennets to return. They never hung a wreath on that door again. And to this day, I still hear a soft jingle in the dead of night every Christmas Eve.